Good heavens. The stench of blood is overwhelming, and she's limping too? How pathetic. As Martha stepped into the room with her uneven gait, his eyes were pinned to her feet. This was a private suite in a luxury estate, and those were the first words uttered by her future in-laws. He wouldn't even listen when told it was the lingering effect of an accident from years ago. I hear you handle raw meat at a market, he continued. The mockery flowed, and the room froze. Her son kept his head bowed, and not a single person stood up to shield her. That day, Martha wasn't even treated as a human being. That silence became a wound she would carry for a lifetime. But did the insult end there? What choice will her son finally make? Welcome to our channel. Before we begin this heartfelt story, please subscribe and like this video. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from so we can send our warmest blessings your way. The biting November wind swept through the historic streets of Boston, carrying the scent of salt from the harbor and the faint metallic promise of an early snow. The city's grandeur was draped in a thick, slate-gray fog that clung to the red brick townhouses of Beacon Hill like a damp wool coat. High above the cobblestones, the glowing amber lights of the Harrison estate cut through the mist, standing as a fortress of old money and clinical perfection. Martha adjusted her shawl, her breath hitching as a sharp tremor shot through her left leg. For over 20 years, that leg had been a roadmap of sacrifice, a jagged reminder of the afternoons she had lunged onto the asphalt to push her son, Ethan, out of the path of a swerving truck. The bone had never quite set right, leaving her with a distinctive, heavy limp that seemed to echo against the polished marble steps of the mansion. Martha was a woman whose beauty was etched in the fine lines around her eyes and the strength of her hands. Those hands, calloused and firm, had spent decades in a small, aromatic shop in Providence, expertly carving prime cuts to ensure her son never knew the hollow ache of an empty stomach. She had scrubbed them until the skin was raw, using a specialized lemon and steel soap to mask the professional scent of the butcher block. But as she stood before the towering oak doors, she felt the phantom weight of the apron she had left behind. The doors swung open, and the warmth of the foyer did little to thaw the icy knot in her chest. Harrison stood at the center of the drawing room, the undisputed son of this cold solar system. He was a man of sharp angles and starched linen, his silver hair slicked back with a precision that matched his reputation as the city's leading surgical mind. Beside him stood his daughter, Clara, a young woman draped in silk the color of a winter moon, her smile as polite and distant as a star. "Ah, the guest of honor has arrived," Harrison announced, though his voice lacked any hint of welcome. His eyes immediately dropped to Martha's feet, tracking the uneven rhythm of her gait as she crossed the Persian rug. Martha offered a small, tentative smile. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Harrison. I'm Martha, Ethan's mother." Ethan stepped forward, a handsome young man in a suit that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month. He looked every bit the Ivy League success Martha had bled for, but his eyes were darting nervously between his mother and his future father-in-law. "Mother, you're here," Ethan said, his voice strangely thin. Harrison didn't extend a hand. Instead, he took a deliberate step back, his nostrils flaring with a theatrical twitch. "Tell me, Martha, was the traffic particularly heavy coming from the rural outskirts?" "The drive from Providence was fine. Thank you," she replied, her voice steady despite the sinking feeling in her gut. "Providence," Harrison repeated, the word sounding like a diagnosis. "A quaint place. I imagine the air there is quite different, heavier, more organic." He paused, raising a manicured hand to his nose. "I must say, I've always found the olfactory memory of a profession to be quite stubborn. No matter how much one scrubs, the essence of the slaughterhouse lingers, doesn't it?" The room fell into a suffocating silence. Martha felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She thought of the thousands of mornings she had woken up at 4 a.m., the rhythmic thud-thud of her knife against the wood, all to pay for the very tuition that had placed Ethan in this man's orbit. She had used the finest oils, the strongest citrus washes, yet Harrison spoke as if she had walked in covered in offal. "I am a butcher, Dr. Harrison," Martha said, her head held high. "It is honest work that built a life for my son." Harrison gave a short, dry chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "Honesty is a charming virtue, but refinement is a necessity at this table. My guests tonight include the dean of the medical board and a senator. They have palates trained for the delicate notes of a vintage Cabernet, not the robust aroma of the meat market. He turned to a waiter standing nearby, then back to Martha with a look of feigned regret. In fact, I have a particularly rare 1982 vintage being decanted as we speak. It is a temperamental wine. I'm afraid even the slightest intrusive scent could bruise the bouquet. Ethan shifted his weight, looking at the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't tell Harrison about the nights his mother's hands had bled from the cold so he could have the best textbooks. He didn't mention that her limp was the reason he was still alive to wear that suit. "Ethan," Martha whispered, her heart breaking in real time. "Mother, please," Ethan muttered, not looking up. "Let's just not make a scene. Dr. Harrison is very particular about his collection." Harrison leaned in, his voice a polished blade. "I think it's best for everyone's comfort if you enjoy your meal in the garden sunroom, Martha. I've had a lovely bistro table set up there for the staff, but the view is quite exceptional. It wouldn't do to have the 1982 ruined by the scent of the kill, would it?" Martha looked at the man she had raised, hoping for a spark of the boy who used to hold her hand when her leg ached. But Ethan remained a statue of cowardice. With a graceful, painful dignity, Martha gripped her shawl. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply turned, her heavy step thumping rhythmically against the floor, a heartbeat in a house that had none. She walked away from the light of the chandelier and into the shadows of the hallway, the scent of lemon soap and old scars trailing behind her. The garden sunroom was a glass cage of exquisite misery. Outside, the Boston fog had curdled into a mean, biting sleet that streaked against the panes like frozen tears. Inside, the air smelled of damp ferns and the faint, bitter tang of the fertilizer used to keep Harrison's exotic orchids blooming in the dead of winter. Martha sat at a small wrought iron table meant for the help, her untouched plate of poached salmon mocking the hollow ache in her chest. From the main dining hall, the muffled sounds of clinking crystal and orchestrated laughter drifted in, a symphony of a world that had deemed her an intruder. She stared at her hands. They looked out of place against the white linen cloth. These were hands that understood the anatomy of sacrifice. They knew how to pull a heavy side of beef from a hook and how to stitch a wound on a toddler's knee. But here they were just butcher's hands, stained by a history Harrison found repulsive. The glass door creaked open. Ethan slipped in, looking over his shoulder as if he were committing a crime. He looked weary, the sharp lines of his designer suit seemingly holding up a man who was collapsing from within. "Mother," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the patter of sleet. Martha didn't look up. "The salmon is cold, Ethan, much like the company." Ethan pulled out the chair opposite her, the metal legs scraping harshly against the stone floor. "You don't understand how high the stakes are. Dr. Harrison isn't just my future father-in-law. He's the board chairman. He holds my residency, my research grants, everything I've worked for in his hands." "I thought I was the one who held those things," Martha said softly, finally meeting his gaze. "In my tired arms, every morning for 20 years. I thought my work was what paid for that degree hanging on your wall." Ethan flinched, his face flushing a deep, guilty red. "And I'm grateful. But this is the final stretch, Mom. If I push back now, he'll ruin me. He's a man who values pedigree and a certain image. Can't you just play along for one night? Just stay here, out of the way, so I can secure my future?" "Your future," Martha repeated, her voice trembling. "Does your future have a place for a mother who limps? Or am I a medical complication you're hoping to excise?" Ethan reached across the table, but he didn't touch her hands. He stopped just short, as if he feared the scent of the shop might actually be contagious. "Please, just understand. This is my only chance to become someone who doesn't have to spend their life in a blood-stained apron." The words cut deeper than any butcher's blade ever could. Martha realized then that the muy thit Harrison loathed wasn't the problem. It was the fact that Ethan loathed it too. He was ashamed of the very foundation he stood upon. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of the sunroom door. Clara stood there, silhouetted against the warm amber light of the hallway. She didn't enter. She simply watched them through the pain, her expression one of clinical detachment. Clara was a woman raised in sterilized environments, her emotions seemingly filtered through the same high-grade mesh as her father's surgical masks. To her, Martha wasn't a mother-in-law. She was a variable that didn't fit the equation of a perfect Boston wedding. She looked at Martha's Cap Kiang leg with a flicker of distaste, as if the physical imperfection itself were an affront to the Harrison aesthetic. Clara tapped a rhythmic, impatient beat on her diamond-encrusted watch and walked away without a word. The message was clear. Time was up. "Go," Martha said, her voice turning as cold as the glass beside her. "Go back to your vintage wine and your clean-handed people." "Mom, go, Ethan, before your image catches a chill." Ethan stood up, his jaw set in a line of stubborn, desperate ambition. He turned and walked back into the warmth of the mansion, leaving Martha alone with the ferns in the dark. Martha stood, her left leg buckling for a moment before she found her balance. She didn't go back through the house. She found a side servant's exit that led directly to the driveway. As she pushed the door open, the Boston winter rushed in to meet her. The rain had turned fully to snow, large wet flakes that swirled in the wind. She began the long walk down the winding, salted driveway of the Harrison estate. Every step was a battle. The cold seeped into the old fracture in her bone, a dull, throbbing pain that vibrated up to her hip. She could hear the faint sound of a violin quartet playing inside the house, a celebratory tune that seemed to push her further into the night. Halfway down the drive, she passed a man huddled near the stone gatehouse. This was Silas, the estate's night groundskeeper. He was an older man with a face like a weathered topographical map, and eyes that had seen enough seasons to know that wealth didn't always mean warmth. He held a thermos of coffee, the steam rising in the freezing air. Silas watched the woman in the fine but thin shawl, limping through the mounting snow. He didn't know her name, but he recognized the weight she carried. It was a weight he saw often on the faces of those who entered the Harrison gates with hope and left with nothing. "It's a long way to the main road on a leg like that, ma'am," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Martha stopped, her breath coming in ragged white plumes. "I've walked further on worse, Silas." "I don't doubt it," the old man replied, nodding toward the house. "Some people spend so much time looking at the stars they forget the ground that holds them up. Watch the ice near the curb. It's deceptive." "Thank you," Martha whispered. She continued her trek. The mansion shrank behind her, a fortress of light fading into the gray-white blur of the storm. As she reached the public sidewalk, she looked back. Her footprints were vivid in the fresh powder, a series of deep, lopsided gouges in the pristine white. They were messy and uneven, the tracks of a woman who had been broken but refused to stop moving. By the time she reached the corner to hail a cab, the snow was already beginning to fill the indentations. Soon the evidence of her presence at the Harrison estate would be erased entirely, as if she had never existed in their world at all. But as the taxi pulled away, Martha looked at her hands again. They were cold and trembling, but they were her own. She rubbed the lemon-scented skin, realizing that no matter how hard she tried to wash away the scent of her life, she would never be clean enough for a son who had forgotten the taste of his own history. The silence of Ethan's betrayal was louder than the roar of the city, a heavy, suffocating blanket that remained long after the lights of Boston had vanished into the rearview mirror. The train ride from Boston back to Providence was a blur of steel-gray landscapes and the rhythmic, jarring click-clack of the tracks that seemed to pulse in Martha's aching leg. By the time she reached her small apartment above the butcher shop, the sun was a bruised purple smear over the horizon. The shop sat quiet, the familiar scent of sawdust and cold iron acting as a familiar embrace. The next morning, the neighborhood was already humming. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had lived on the same street for 40 years and possessed a heart as large as her collection of floral aprons, was the first to knock on the shop's glass door. She was the kind of neighbor who knew the rhythm of everyone's lives, often delivering fresh-baked blueberry muffins in exchange for the gossip she claimed kept her young. "Martha, you're back," Mrs. Gable chirped as she stepped inside, her eyes bright with curiosity. "How was the big city? How is that handsome son of yours? I bet that fancy Boston family was just head over heels for our favorite butcher." Martha felt a sharp pang in her chest, but she forced her lips into a practiced, gentle smile. She began wiping down the clean display case, her movements slow. Boston is very grand, Mrs. Gable. A lot of marble and very long hallways. And the wedding, have they set the date? Mrs. Gable leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We're all so proud of Ethan. A doctor in the family. It's like a fairy tale. Martha paused, staring at the reflection of her tired eyes in the glass. Ethan is doing very well. He's working so hard. He has a very bright future ahead of him, Mrs. Gable. Perhaps brighter than any of us can imagine. Well, he deserves it after all you've done, the old woman said, patting Martha's hand before leaving. Martha watched her go, the smile fading instantly. The weight of the lie felt heavier than a side of beef. Meanwhile, back in the sterile, high-altitude silence of Dr. Harrison's private study in Boston, the atmosphere was far from a fairy tale. Harrison sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of dark walnut, a fountain pen poised over a document that looked more like a legal summons than a family arrangement. Ethan sat opposite him, looking as though he hadn't slept since the night of the dinner. The opulence of the room, with its floor-to-ceiling medical journals and leather-bound classics, felt like a cage closing in. Success, Ethan, requires the removal of friction, Harrison began, his voice smooth and cold as a scalpel. Your surgical skills are exemplary, and your research on cardiac regeneration is the jewel of this hospital. But a surgeon's reputation is a delicate ecosystem. It cannot survive the intrusion of, shall we say, unrefined variables. He slid the paper across the desk. It was a formal agreement, drafted with the cold precision of a man who viewed human relationships as biological systems to be managed. This is a covenant, Ethan, Harrison continued, a commitment to the Harrison legacy. In exchange for the chief residency position and the funding for your new laboratory, you will commit to a standard of social conduct. This includes a complete restructuring of your public associations. Ethan's eyes scanned the lines. His heart hammered against his ribs. Section 4.2, Personal Background and Public Image. It was written in legalese, but the message was a jagged blade. Ethan was to distance himself entirely from his previous life. He was to be a Harrison in name and spirit. He was to cut ties with the shop in Providence. He was to cut ties with the woman who limped. Clara expects a husband who belongs in her world, not one who brings the scent of the market into the ballroom, Harrison added, leaning back. Sign it, and the future is yours. Refuse, and you'll find that Boston can be a very small, very cold place for an unaffiliated doctor. Ethan looked at the pen. He thought of his mother's face in the sunroom. He thought of the years of struggle, but he also thought of the laboratory, the prestige, the life he had dreamed of since he was a boy staring at the sterile white coats in the hospital. His ambition, a hungry beast he had fed for years, growled in his ear. With a trembling hand, Ethan took the pen and signed. The scratch of the nib on the parchment sounded like a bone snapping. Days later, back in Providence, the mail arrived. Martha was used to getting postcards from Ethan during his travels, or quick notes about his exams. But the envelope she held now was thick, cream-colored, and bore the embossed seal of the Harrison estate. She sat at her kitchen table, the afternoon sun casting long, golden bars across the linoleum. She opened it with careful fingers. There was no "Dear Mom." There was only a single sheet of heavy paper. Mother, the letter began, the handwriting jagged and hurried. The wedding is being finalized for next month. It will be a very high-profile event with many of Dr. Harrison's colleagues and benefactors. This is the most important moment of my career. For the sake of the family's peace, and for my future, it would be best if you did not attend. The Harrisons are very traditional, and your presence would complicate the social dynamic they have worked so hard to build. I will send you photos. Please understand that I am doing this for us, for the life you always wanted me to have. I need you to stay in Providence. Please, for my sake, do not come to Boston. Ethan. Martha didn't cry. She couldn't. It felt as though her heart had been professionally removed, leaving only a cold, hollow cavity where her love had once lived. She read the letter again, her thumb tracing the word complicate. She had pushed him out of the way of a truck, and in return he was pushing her out of his life. She stood up, her leg throbbing with a sudden, sharp intensity. She walked to the window and looked down at the street where Mrs. Gable was waving at a passing neighbor. "A very bright future," Martha whispered to the empty room, the letter slipping from her fingers like a dead leaf. She turned and went back down into the shop. She picked up her knife. The steel was cold, familiar, and honest. The only thing in her world that didn't lie. She began to work, the rhythmic thud of the blade against the wood echoing the slow, steady breaking of her spirit. The winter in Providence had settled into a relentless, bone-chilling dampness. The cobblestones outside Martha's shop were slick with a treacherous mix of slush and engine oil. Inside, the shop was a sanctuary of flickering yellow light and the rhythmic hum of the refrigerators. Martha worked with a mechanical intensity, her hands moving over a rack of lamb with a precision that bordered on the surgical. Every time her left leg throbbed, she saw the ghost of a massive chrome grill and felt the hot breath of a screeching tire. It had been 20 years, but the memory was a permanent resident in her mind. She could still feel the jarring impact as her shoulder hit the pavement, the agonizing snap of her femur, and the sight of a 4-year-old Ethan staring back at her from the safety of the sidewalk, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. She had traded her gait for his life. Now as she looked at the crumpled, cream-colored letter from Boston sitting on her counter, she wondered if she had also traded her heart for a ghost. As the clock struck 6, a heavy thud against the front glass made her jump. A man had collapsed on the icy sidewalk just outside her door. He was a heap of ragged wool and stained denim, his long, matted beard dusted with sleet. Martha rushed out, her limp heavy but her instincts sharp. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, kneeling in the slush despite the protest from her knee. The man groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were a piercing, intelligent blue, though clouded by fever and exhaustion. This was Dr. Arthur Sterling. Once a brilliant thoracic surgeon with a penchant for classical poetry and a reputation for impossible saves, he now lived in the periphery of society. His hands, though trembling, still bore the scrubbed cleanliness of a man who had spent a lifetime in sterile theaters. Martha helped him inside, her strength surprising them both. She sat him by the radiator and brought a bowl of hot beef broth, the steam rising between them like a peace offering. "You have a surgeon's hands," Arthur whispered, his voice a dry rasp as he clutched the bowl. "But your rhythm is off. The left leg, femoral fracture, poorly set?" Martha paused, a ladle midair. "You're a doctor?" "I was a ghost before I was a beggar," Arthur replied with a bitter smile. He looked around the shop, his gaze settling on the Boston newspaper Martha had left open, featuring a small social blurb about the upcoming Harrison Webb wedding. His face went ashen. "Harrison, you know him." "Our families are connected," Martha said cautiously. Arthur's hands shook, sloshing the broth. "Connected, like a parasite to a host. 20 years ago, that man sat in my office as my junior partner. I had developed a protocol for non-invasive valve repair, a patent that would have changed the field. Harrison didn't just want to share the glory, he wanted to own it. He falsified a series of surgical errors under my name. He buried my career in a mountain of fabricated malpractice suits and walked away with my life's work." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sleet outside. "He destroyed you to get ahead?" "He doesn't see people, Martha. He sees ladders," Arthur said. He reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a heavy, water-damaged leather portfolio. "I've spent 2 decades carrying the weight of his sins. I was too broken to fight then, but I kept the originals, the real data, the proof that he manipulated the medical board and drained the research funds of his predecessors to build that glass palace in Boston." Martha took the portfolio. The leather was cold and smelled of damp earth and old ink. As she opened it, she saw a soul's covenant. Not a legal document, but a pattern of betrayal. There were financial ledgers with altered dates, correspondence with board members that hinted at bribery, and the original surgical notes that proved Arthur Sterling, not Harrison, was the mind behind the hospital's most prestigious accolades. "Why give this to me?" Martha asked, her voice a whisper. "Because I saw you through the window," Arthur said, his blue eyes clear and tragic. "I saw the way you move. You carry a sacrifice in your bones, just like I do. But you still have a voice. He hasn't silenced you yet. Martha spent the night at her kitchen table, Arthur asleep on her sofa. She pored over the documents, her butcher's eye for detail catching the inconsistencies in Harrison's perfect history. This wasn't just a collection of papers. It was a map of a man's corruption. It was the justice she hadn't known she was seeking. Among the yellowed pages, she found a specific file labeled Malpractice Settlement 2005. It detailed how Harrison had used hospital funds to pay off a grieving family after an experimental procedure went wrong. A procedure he had performed while Sterling was being forced out. Harrison had signed the checks himself, bypassing the board to hide the failure. Martha looked at the letter Ethan had sent her, the one asking her to stay away to avoid complicating the social dynamic. A new kind of fire began to burn in her chest, hotter and more purposeful than the pain in her leg. Harrison thought he could hide the scent of the slaughterhouse, but he was the one covered in the blood of broken careers and stolen dreams. He thought he had bought her son's soul with a prestigious title. Martha gripped the portfolio. She wasn't just a butcher from Providence anymore. She was the keeper of a truth that could bring a fortress down. She looked at Arthur, then out at the dark Boston skyline in the distance. He thinks I'm an unrefined variable, she murmured to the empty shop. He's about to find out how a variable can solve an entire equation. As dawn broke over the gray Atlantic, Martha didn't start her usual prep work. Instead, she sat down and began to write. She wasn't writing a plea for an invitation. She was writing a reckoning. The morning sun over Providence didn't bring warmth, but it brought a clarity that Martha hadn't felt in years. The portfolio from Arthur Sterling sat on her kitchen table like a dormant volcano, heavy with the power to level the glass and steel towers of Boston's medical elite. Martha watched the steam rise from her black coffee, her eyes resting on a small silver-framed photograph tucked behind the sugar jar. In the photo, a young Ethan was laughing, his face smudged with dirt, clutching a wooden toy boat she had bought him with her first week's wages. She had been so proud of that dirt, of that laughter, and of the future she was building for him, 1 pound of brisket at a time. I didn't raise you to be a shadow in a gold-plated cage, she whispered to the empty room. I taught you to walk so you could stand tall. If you've forgotten how to be a man, Ethan, then your mother will just have to show you one last time. She reached into the pantry and pulled out a battered metal tin, an old biscuit container. Inside was the emergency fund, a collection of tightly rolled $100 bills she had tucked away for 20 years. It was meant for a down payment on a house for Ethan, or perhaps his first car. It was her life's blood, saved by skipping meals and mending her own shoes until the soles were thin as paper. Today, that money had a new purpose. It wasn't for a house, it was for a war. Martha closed the shop, hanging a sign that simply read, Out for Justice, back when the truth is told. She limped down to the legal district of Providence, her heavy steps sounding more like a drumbeat than a disability. She was looking for Elias Thorne. Elias was a man who lived in a basement office crowded with stacks of pro bono files and the smell of cheap cigars. He was a bulldog lawyer, a man with a shock of unruly white hair in a suit that had seen better decades, known for taking the cases that the high-rise firms were too scared to touch. Harrison, Elias asked, leaning back until his chair groaned in protest after Martha laid out the documents. Martha, Harrison is the king of Beacon Hill. He has lawyers who charge by the second and friends in every courthouse from here to D.C. He has power, Elias. But I have the truth, Martha replied, placing the biscuit tin on his desk. This is every penny I have. I don't want a settlement. I want a reckoning. He's trying to swallow my son's soul, and I won't let him choke on it. Elias looked at the soul's covenant Ethan had signed, then at the Sterling portfolio. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face. Keep your money for the train fare, Martha. A chance to bite the leg of a man like Harrison is payment enough for me. But you realize what this means? If we pull this thread, Ethan's bright future might unravel along with it. Better he stands on his own feet in the dirt than on a pedestal built of lies, she said firmly. The subplot began to weave its own web. While Martha coordinated with Elias, Arthur Sterling began to regain his strength in her apartment. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a guide. He helped Elias decipher the complex medical coding Harrison had used to hide his financial thefts, revealing a deeper layer of ghost surgeries, procedures billed to insurance for patients who were already deceased or had never been admitted. 3 days later, Martha returned to Boston. This time, she didn't take the train. She hired a car, sitting in the back seat with the sterling portfolio clutched to her chest. She wore her best Sunday dress, a simple navy blue wool, and she had polished her shoes until they shone. The fog of her last visit had cleared, replaced by a cold, brilliant sunlight that made the Massachusetts General Hospital complex look like a fortress of ice. She bypassed the main reception, her limp fast and purposeful. She knew Harrison's schedule from the wedding invitation notes Ethan had inadvertently left behind. At 2:00 p.m., Harrison held his private consultation hour in his penthouse office. The secretary, a young woman named Becky who wore her hair in a tight professional bun and moved with the silent efficiency of a robot, tried to intercept her. "Ma'am, do you have an appointment? Dr. Harrison is in a high-level briefing." "Tell him Martha is here," she said, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "Tell him the unrefined variable has found the solution to his equation." Becky hesitated, caught by the sheer authority in Martha's eyes, and before she could speak, Martha pushed open the double oak doors. Harrison was standing by the window, his back to the room, pointing out the site of a new hospital wing to a group of nervous-looking board members. Ethan was there too, standing just behind Harrison, holding a tablet and looking like a well-dressed shadow. "Harrison!" Martha barked. The room went dead silent. Harrison turned slowly, his face transitioning from irritation to a mask of practiced boredom. "Martha, I believe your invitation was quite clear about the geographical boundaries of our relationship." Ethan's face went white. "Mother, what are you doing here? I told you." "You told me to stay away to keep the peace, Ethan," Martha said, walking toward the center of the room. Every heavy thud of her left foot seemed to vibrate the expensive floor. "But there is no peace in a house built on a graveyard." "Security," Harrison sighed, waving a hand toward the phone. "Don't bother," Martha said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the sterling portfolio. With a swift, deliberate motion, she threw it across the long mahogany conference table. The leather bindings skidded across the polished surface, scattering yellowed pages and bank statements directly in front of the board members. "That," Martha said, pointing a calloused finger at the mess, "is the refinement you're so proud of. It's 20 years of theft, Arthur Sterling's stolen patent, and the ghost surgery bills you've been sending to the state." Harrison looked at the papers, his clinical composure finally cracking. His eyes darted to the board members, who were already picking up the documents with trembling hands. "This is a delusional fantasy from a woman who smells of the slaughterhouse," Harrison hissed, leaning over the table. "Maybe so," Martha replied, leaning in until she was inches from his face. "But the slaughterhouse knows how to spot a rotten heart. I'm not here to ask for an invite to your wedding, Harrison. I'm here to tell you that the soul's covenant you made my son sign is void. Because you don't own a soul, you only own a collection of debts. And today, I'm calling them all in." She turned to Ethan, who was staring at a document proving Harrison had faked the very research data Ethan had been admiring for years. "Ethan," she said, her voice softening but remaining iron strong, "look at the man you sold your mother for. Is he worth the price?" Martha didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel, her limp rhythmic and defiant, leaving the room in a state of absolute shattered silence. She had thrown the stone. Now she would watch the glass palace crumble. The dust had barely settled in the boardroom before the empire struck back. Harrison, a man who viewed his reputation as a sacred monument, did not retreat. He retaliated with the cold, calculated precision of a cornered predator. Within 48 hours of Martha's confrontation, a fleet of black sedans descended upon the quiet streets of Providence. The legal assault was swift and surgical. Harrison had leveraged his influence with the Municipal Health Board and a high-priced corporate law firm to file an emergency injunction against Martha's shop. The claim was as baseless as it was devastating, an alleged public health hazard stemming from improper waste disposal and outdated refrigeration units. Martha stood at the curb of her life's work, watching as a city official taped a bright orange cease and desist order to the front glass. Standing beside her was Elias Thorne, his jaw set in a grim line as he looked at the paperwork. "He's not trying to win a legal battle, Martha," Elias muttered, tucking a cigar behind his ear. "He's trying to starve you out. He wants you so buried in litigation fees and city fines that you can't afford to keep me on the payroll, let alone fight him in Boston." Martha didn't flinch. She looked at the orange sign, then at the heavy, rusted keys in her hand. "He can lock the doors, Elias, but he can't lock away the truth. I've lived on scraps before. He doesn't know that a woman who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous opponent he'll ever face." As Martha hunkered down in her apartment, the battle moved to the sterile halls of Boston. While Harrison worked to destroy Martha's livelihood, he was losing his grip on his own house. Clara, usually the silent shadow of her father's ambition, had begun to change. She had seen the raw power in Martha's eyes, a strength that didn't come from a bank account or a medical title. Clara began to spend hours in the hospital's archive room, ostensibly organizing her father's files for the wedding transition. It was there she met Julian, a young medical intern with thick glasses and an earnest, slightly nervous disposition. Julian had been the one tasked with the unenviable job of digitizing the old Sterling records before they were disposed of. "Dr. Harrison is very thorough," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly as he handed Clara a digitized log. "But sometimes, when you look at the raw data instead of the final reports, the math doesn't add up. It's like someone tried to smooth over the rough edges of a failure." Clara looked at the discrepancies Julian pointed out, the very same ghost surgeries Martha had mentioned. She felt a cold shiver. Her father wasn't a healer. He was an architect of illusions. Seeing Martha, a woman who struggled to walk, yet stood taller than anyone she knew, had broken the spell of Harrison's clinical perfection. While Clara grappled with her father's dark side, Ethan was confronting a ghost. Arthur Sterling, now clean-shaven and wearing a suit Elias had found in a thrift shop, stood in the small park across from the hospital. He had sent a message to Ethan through a mutual contact, inviting him to talk. Ethan met him on a bench under a skeletal oak tree. "My mother says you were a doctor," Ethan said, his voice guarded. "I was a surgeon, Ethan. I was also a man who let your mother save his life when he had no right to it," Arthur said, his blue eyes piercing. "But I'm not here to talk about Harrison's thefts. I'm here to talk about the limp your mother carries." Ethan looked away, the old shame prickling his skin. "I know about the accident. She pushed me out of the way of a truck." "No, Ethan," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a somber whisper. "You don't know. You were 4. You remember a screech and a fall. But I was there at the hospital when she was brought in. I was the intern who saw the scans. The truck didn't just clip her. She lunged under the chassis to pull you out of the wheel well. She didn't just save you. She chose to be crushed so you wouldn't be." Arthur leaned in closer. The doctor told her that if she stayed in the hospital for 6 months and had 3 more surgeries, she might walk normally again. But she refused. Do you know why? Because you were terrified. You wouldn't eat, you wouldn't sleep, and the bills were mounting. She left the hospital against medical advice so she could get back to that shop and provide for you. She traded her future as a healthy woman for your peace of mind. Every step she takes in pain is a love letter she never sent. Ethan felt as if the air had been kicked out of his lungs. He had spent years resenting that limp, viewing it as a mark of her unrefined nature, never realizing it was the physical manifestation of her devotion. He looked at the hospital, the glass palace he had sold his soul to enter, and suddenly it looked like a tomb. The day before the wedding, the Harrison mansion was a hive of frantic activity. Florists were hauling in thousands of white roses, and the sound of a string quartet rehearsing filled the ballroom. Harrison stood in his study, a glass of brandy in his hand, looking triumphant as he reviewed the news of Martha's shop being shuttered. "Order is restored," he said to Clara, who was standing by the window. "Is it, Father?" Clara asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "I've seen the Sterling files. I know what Julian found. I know what you did to that woman." Harrison's face went purple. "You will be silent, Clara. You will wear that dress, you will marry that doctor, and you will maintain this family's dignity." The door to the study burst open. Ethan walked in, still wearing his white lab coat, but he had torn the embroidered Harrison Medical Center patch from the breast. He looked at Harrison with a clarity that was terrifying. "The wedding is off," Ethan said. Harrison let out a bark of laughter. Don't be absurd. The guests are already arriving. Your career is tied to this family. My career is tied to my mother's sacrifice, Ethan retorted, stepping toward the desk. He pulled the signed Soul's Covenant from his pocket and threw it into the fireplace. The paper curled and blackened in the flames. I resign, Harrison, effective immediately. I'd rather be a butcher in Providence than a fraud in Boston. You'll have nothing, Harrison screamed, the brandy sloshing over his hand. I'll make sure you never practice medicine again. I'll crush that shop into the dirt. You can try, Ethan said, turning to Clara. I'm sorry, Clara. I hope you find the strength to leave this place too. Clara looked at her father, then back at Ethan. I already have. I've sent the sterling digital logs to the state prosecutor's office. Julian is testifying as we speak. Harrison slumped into his chair, the brandy glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. The order he had fought so hard to maintain was dissolving into chaos. Ethan didn't wait to see the end. He ran to his car and drove through the night, the Boston skyline disappearing in his rearview mirror. He reached Providence just as the sun was beginning to touch the Atlantic. Martha was sitting on the front steps of her closed shop, her shawl wrapped tight, looking out at the quiet street. Ethan got out of the car and walked toward her. He didn't say a word. He simply knelt at her feet, leaning his head against her worn navy blue dress. Martha's hand, calloused and smelling of lemon soap, rested gently on his hair. I'm home, Mom, he whispered. I know, Ethan, Martha replied, her voice thick with a triumphant grace. I've been waiting 20 years for you to find your way back to the ground. The morning following Ethan's return was hushed, as if the world were holding its breath. Providence was draped in a silver frost that made the cobblestones glisten, though the orange cease and desist order still clung stubbornly to the butcher shop's window like a jagged scar. Martha and Ethan sat in the small kitchen upstairs, sharing a pot of tea. The silence between them was no longer heavy with secrets. It was a quiet, healing space where 20 years of unspoken sacrifice finally began to settle. I don't know if I can ever be the doctor you raised me to be, Mom, Ethan said, staring into his cup. Not after everything Harrison showed me about what that world can do to a soul. Martha reached across the table, her calloused thumb brushing his knuckles. Being a doctor isn't about the title, Ethan. It's about the hands. If your hands are clean of lies, you're already halfway there. Their peace was shattered by a sound that made Martha's blood run cold. The screech of tires on black ice followed by the sickening, thunderous crunch of metal meeting stone. It happened at the intersection just 50 yards from her shop. Martha was out the door before Ethan could stand, her limp forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. She navigated the slick pavement with a desperate, practiced urgency. At the corner, a sleek, black sedan had veered off the road, striking a heavy granite monument. The front end was crumpled like tinfoil, and steam hissed violently from the shattered radiator. As Martha reached the driver's side, she saw a face she hadn't expected to see in Providence. Harrison. He was slumped over the steering wheel, his face a mask of blood and glass shards. He had been fleeing Boston, driven by the panic of the impending investigation, only to be trapped by the very ice he had once mocked. His breathing was ragged, a wet, rattling sound that Martha recognized instantly from her years of handling the anatomy of life. Ethan, call 911! Martha screamed over her shoulder as she wrenched the jammed door open with a strength born of decades of hauling heavy sides of beef. Harrison stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up, his vision blurred by blood, and saw Martha. To him, in his state of shock, she looked like a towering, vengeful ghost. But as his senses cleared, he realized she wasn't there for revenge. Martha didn't hesitate. She saw the arterial spray from a deep gash on Harrison's neck. A jagged piece of the windshield had found a home in his carotid path. Without a second thought, Martha reached into the wreckage. Her hands, which Harrison had claimed reeked of the slaughterhouse, pressed firmly against the wound. Stay with me, Harrison, she commanded, her voice like iron. She had spent her life understanding blood, the way it flowed, the way it pooled, and how to stop it. She used her shawl, a simple wool wrap, to create a makeshift pressure bandage, her fingers digging in with surgical precision. Harrison stared at her, his eyes wide with a terrifying, lucid realization. This woman, the unrefined variable he had banished to the sunroom, the woman he had tried to starve into silence, was currently the only thing keeping his life from leaking onto the Providence pavement. He could smell it again, the scent of lemon soap, cold steel, and the faint, earthy tang of her trade. But as he looked into her eyes, he didn't see the slaughterhouse. He saw a fierce, radiant mercy. Officer Holloway, a burly man with a salt and pepper mustache and 20 years on the Providence force, arrived on the scene first. He was used to the grit of the city, but he stopped short at the sight of Martha knee-deep in glass, her hands stained crimson as she held the titan of Boston medicine together. "Martha, do you need me to take over?" Holloway asked, kneeling beside her. "Hold his head steady, Holloway," Martha snapped, her focus never wavering. "If I let go for even a second, he's gone. Ethan, where's that ambulance?" Ethan appeared at her side, his face pale but his hand steady. He looked at Harrison, then at his mother. In that moment, he saw the true meaning of the GED techniques he had once learned in theory but never understood in practice. This was the transformation hook in real time, the miraculous change from pain to a higher purpose. "The paramedics are turning the corner, Mom," Ethan whispered, placing his hand over hers to help maintain the pressure. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics moved with frantic speed. They eased Harrison onto a gurney, but they couldn't remove Martha's hands until they had a mechanical clamp ready. For those few minutes, Martha was the only bridge Harrison had to the world of the living. As they loaded him into the back of the rig, Harrison reached out, his fingers trembling, and caught Martha's sleeve. His voice was a broken whisper, stripped of all its former arrogance. "Why?" Martha looked at him, her face smudged with his blood. "Because life is sacred, Harrison, even yours." The ambulance doors slammed shut. Inside the sterile, humming interior, the lead paramedic, a young man named Tyler with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, began hooking Harrison up to the monitors. Tyler was a veteran of the road who had seen the worst of humanity, but he noticed the way the patient was staring at his own blood-stained hands. Harrison began to sob. It wasn't the cry of a man in physical pain, but the heaving, soul-deep wail of a man whose world had been shattered and rebuilt in a single hour. He looked at the wool fibers from Martha's shawl still clinging to his skin. "I called it the smell of death," Harrison choked out, the tears carving clean paths through the blood on his cheeks. "I thought it was the slaughterhouse." He looked at Tyler, his voice trembling with a profound, sudden epiphany. "But it wasn't. It was the smell of the life I've been wasting. It was the only thing that was real." Harrison realized then that the mouille-mo, scent of blood, he had spent a lifetime trying to sterilize and look down upon, was not a mark of shame. It was the scent of the struggle, the sacrifice, and the raw, unpolished love that Martha had carried every day while he sat in his glass tower. In the back of that ambulance, speeding toward the hospital he no longer owned, Harrison finally understood that refinement without heart was just a fancy way of being dead. Martha stood on the corner, Ethan's arm around her shoulders, watching the sirens fade into the distance. Her hands were red, her shawl was ruined, and her leg throbbed with a vengeance. But as the sun finally broke through the frost, she felt a miracle of her own. She had saved the man who tried to destroy her, and in doing so, she had finally washed the last of the bitterness from her own soul. The winter had finally broken its grip on New England. Along the banks of the Providence River, the ice had melted into a sparkling sapphire blue, and the first stubborn crocuses were pushing through the thawing earth. In Boston, the glass towers still stood, but the man who once ruled them had fallen. The legal storm had been absolute. Following the evidence provided by Clara and Martha, the state medical board and federal prosecutors had dismantled Harrison's empire piece by piece. Harrison, stripped of his medical license and his chairmanship, sat in a quiet rehabilitation center on the outskirts of the city. He was no longer the sharp-edged titan of surgery. He was a man learning to live with the weight of a conscience. His physical wounds from the accident had healed into faint silvery lines, but the internal transformation was the true miracle. One spring afternoon, a soft knock echoed against Harrison's door. Martha stood there, wearing a simple linen dress, her distinctive limp now a rhythmic, steady presence. Beside her was Silas, the former groundskeeper from the Harrison estate. After the scandal broke, Silas had left the estate and found a new life in Providence, working as a mentor for at-risk youth. Silas was a man of quiet dignity who believed that every garden and every person deserved a second chance at blooming. Harrison looked up, his eyes filling with a complicated mixture of shame and gratitude. "Martha," he whispered, standing up with the help of a cane. "I didn't come to talk about the past, Harrison," Martha said, her voice warm like the spring air. Harrison stepped forward, his former arrogance replaced by a raw, quiet vulnerability. "I spent my life looking down at hands like yours. I thought prestige was something you wore like a white coat. I was wrong. You saved me with the very thing I mocked. I am so deeply sorry, Martha. Not just for the dinner, but for the man I allowed myself to become." Martha offered a small, forgiving nod. "The truth has a way of cleaning even the oldest wounds, Harrison. I hope you find peace in the quiet." As they left, Silas placed a weathered hand on Harrison's shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity between two men who had finally found common ground. Back in the heart of Providence, the cease and desist order was long gone, replaced by a vibrant new sign: the Sterling and Martha Community Kitchen and Clinic. With the help of Elias Thorne and the now restored Dr. Arthur Sterling, the old butcher shop had been transformed. It was no longer just a place for prime cuts, it was a sanctuary. Arthur Sterling had used his reclaimed reputation and the settlements from Harrison's malpractice suits to fund a free clinic in the back of the building. Here, those who were overlooked by the grand hospitals of Boston, the uninsured, the homeless, and the disabled, received world-class care. Ethan had found his true calling here. He no longer wore the embroidered patches of a corporate medical center. Instead, he wore a simple navy blue scrub top, working side by side with Arthur. Ethan had become a doctor of the people, a man whose bright future was now measured in the lives he touched rather than the awards he won. He spent his mornings in the clinic and his afternoons helping his mother in the shop. The shop itself had become a nonprofit butcher and grocery. Martha taught the silent voice technique to local apprentices, showing them how to connect with the community through the craft of providing honest, soul-sustaining food. The proceeds went entirely to a scholarship fund for students from backgrounds like Ethan's. Late that afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Martha and Ethan took their daily walk along the river. "Your leg, Mom," Ethan noticed, watching her gait. "You're moving faster today." Martha laughed, a sound like clear bells. "It's a strange thing, Ethan. For 20 years, I felt every crack in the bone. But lately, the weight is gone. It's as if my heart finally convinced my leg that the sacrifice was over. My soul is whole, and my body is just following along." They stopped at a wooden bench overlooking the water. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming lilacs and the salty tang of the nearby ocean. "I used to be so afraid of the smell of this life," Ethan said, looking at his own hands. "I thought I needed to be sterile to be successful. But every patient I treat, every person we feed, I realize I'm just continuing what you started in that shop." He turned to his mother, his eyes shining with a deep, reverent love. Ethan moved from the bench and knelt on the soft grass before her, just as he had on that night of his return. But this time it wasn't a gesture of desperation, it was an act of worship. He took Martha's hands in his. They were rough, scarred by years of hard work and lemon soap, the fingernails short and the skin calloused. He bowed his head and pressed a long, tender kiss to her palms. "Harrison called these unrefined," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But he was blind. These are the hands that held me when I was small, that pushed me out of death's way, and that held a broken man together on a frozen street. To me, Mom, these are the sweetest smelling hands in the world. They smell like life. They smell like home." Martha's eyes blurred with tears, not of pain, but of a joy so profound it felt like a miracle. She looked down at her son, the doctor who had finally learned the true anatomy of a human heart. Together they sat in the glow of the Providence sunset. The sky was a magnificent tapestry of gold, amber, and deep violet, a mythological fire reflecting on the water. The GD journey was complete. The unlikely hero had won her battle, the transformation was absolute, and the justice had been tempered with mercy. As the first stars began to twinkle over the city, Martha leaned her head against her son's shoulder. The limp didn't matter. The shop didn't matter. Only the love remained, a timeless myth told with modern tenderness, echoing through the streets of the city they had made their own. The story of Martha and Ethan teaches us that the true fragrance of a human being does not come from expensive perfumes or high-status titles, but from the quiet, persistent aroma of sacrifice and integrity. We often spend our lives chasing the refinement of the world, forgetting that the ground beneath our feet was held steady by the calloused hands of those who loved us first. Never be ashamed of a humble beginning or a mother's worn-out apron, for those are the very things that provide the strength to stand tall when the world tries to bring you down. If Martha's journey of faith and forgiveness touched your heart today, please help us spread this message of hope. Like this video to honor all the hardworking mothers, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth, and comment your thoughts below. If you want to see more stories of transformation and redemption, don't forget to subscribe to Key GIA Journage and turn on the notification bell. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the mothers who sacrifice in silence and for the miracles that happen when we choose mercy over pride. Please bless every person watching this video. Heal their old wounds, restore their broken family bonds, and give them the strength to walk with dignity, no matter how difficult the path may be. May your grace turn their trials into triumphs and their pain into a platform for your love. If you believe that God can restore any heart and bring every lost child back home, please type Amen in the comments below.